James Mitchell hadn't expected anything unusual when he decided to walk through Washington Park that evening. The successful tech entrepreneur often used the quiet paths to decompress after long days at his Denver headquarters. At 45, he'd built a software empire worth billions, but lately he'd felt something missing, a purpose beyond profit margins and stock prices. Sophie's crying cut through that evening calm like a knife. She sat hunched on a green bench near the playground, her small shoulders heaving with each sob. The October sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty park. Most families had already headed home for dinner, leaving the space eerily quiet except for her desperate weeping. "Sweetie, where are your parents?" James asked, approaching carefully. He knew better than to alarm a child who was already frightened. When Sophie looked up, her blue eyes were pools of terror. "The boogeyman hurts me every night," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "He comes when it gets dark and he makes everything hurt, and I can't breathe and Mommy doesn't believe me." James felt his blood run cold. On her arms, he could see dark marks that looked disturbingly like bruises. Her clothes were worn and slightly too small, and she had a thinness that spoke of missed meals. "Can you tell me where you live, Sophie?" he asked gently. "I want to help you." "The basement apartment on Alameda," she said, starting to cry harder. "But I can't go back there. The boogeyman is waiting for me. He's always waiting when it gets dark." James immediately dialed 911, his years of business training kicking in. This was a situation that needed professionals, but he wouldn't leave Sophie alone for even a moment. As he spoke to the dispatcher, he shed his jacket and draped it over the shivering child. "Help is coming," he told her softly. "I promise you're going to be okay. Nobody is going to hurt you anymore." Sophie looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Really? You promise?" "I promise," James said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Within 10 minutes, a police car arrived. Officer Tom Jensen stepped out, a tall man in his 40s with kind eyes that immediately put Sophie at ease. Right behind him came a silver sedan, and a woman with a professional briefcase emerged. "I'm Maggie Collins, with Child Protective Services," she introduced herself to James, then knelt down to Sophie's level. "Hi, Sophie. I'm here to help you feel safe. Can you tell me about the boogeyman?" Sophie's description was chilling. A dark presence that came every night. Pain that made her head pound and her stomach twist. A feeling like she couldn't get enough air. Fear that consumed her until morning came. "We need to locate the mother and see the living situation," Officer Jensen said quietly to James. "Thank you for staying with her. A lot of people would have just kept walking." James shook his head. "I couldn't do that. Not to a child who needs help." As they prepared to visit Sophie's home, James made a decision. "I'm coming with you. I want to make sure she's truly safe." Maggie looked surprised but nodded. "That's unusual, but I can see Sophie trusts you. Let's go find some answers." The basement apartment on Alameda Avenue was in a converted older home, the kind that had been subdivided to maximize rental income. James noticed immediately how dark and cramped the entrance looked, with narrow stairs leading down below street level. Officer Jensen knocked firmly on the door. "Denver Police. We need to speak with Rachel Turner." The door opened to reveal a thin woman with Sophie's same blue eyes, but hers were filled with exhaustion and sudden panic. "What happened? Is Sophie okay? Oh God, where is she?" "Mommy." Sophie ran forward, and Rachel dropped to her knees to embrace her daughter. "Mrs. Turner, I'm Officer Jensen. We found Sophie in Washington Park, saying some concerning things about being hurt at night. She mentioned a boogeyman." Rachel's face crumpled with frustration and guilt. "The nightmares. She's been having these terrible nightmares for weeks. I've tried everything. Night lights, staying in her room, even sleeping in the same bed. But I work 2 jobs and I'm just so tired." Maggie stepped forward with a gentleness James admired. "May we come inside and talk? We need to understand what's happening so we can help Sophie." The apartment was small but clean, though James noticed the chill in the air immediately. There was only one small space heater running, barely making a dent in the October cold. The furniture was sparse and worn. A hot plate sat on the counter instead of a proper stove. This was poverty, real and grinding. "When did Sophie's symptoms start?" Maggie asked, pulling out a notepad. Rachel wiped her eyes. About 3 weeks ago. She started complaining about headaches and stomach aches every evening. Then the nightmares began. She'd wake up screaming about something in the dark that was hurting her. I took her to the free clinic, but they said it was probably stress from me working so much. James watched Sophie closely. The little girl was clinging to her mother, but kept glancing nervously toward the back of the apartment where the bedrooms must be. Mrs. Turner, may I ask about Sophie's father? Officer Jensen's voice was professional but kind. He left 2 years ago. No child support, no contact. It's just been us. Rachel's voice broke. I'm doing my best. I swear I'm doing everything I can. Maggie walked slowly through the apartment, and James followed. The space was cramped and dark, with only one small window near the ceiling providing natural light. In Sophie's tiny bedroom, Maggie ran her hand along the wall and frowned. Mrs. Turner, when was the last time you had your furnace inspected? Rachel looked confused. Furnace? The landlord handles all that. Why? Maggie and Officer Jensen exchanged a meaningful look. I'd like to call someone to check something, Maggie said carefully. Within the hour, a city inspector arrived with detection equipment. What he found made everyone's blood run cold. The furnace in the building had a cracked heat exchanger, and carbon monoxide levels in the basement apartment were dangerously high. Highest in Sophie's bedroom. This is what's been hurting her, the inspector explained. Carbon monoxide poisoning. It causes headaches, nausea, confusion, and in high doses, hallucinations. She's been literally being poisoned every night. Rachel's legs gave out, and Officer Jensen caught her. Oh my God. Oh my God, I almost killed my own daughter. No, James said firmly, speaking for the first time in a while. You didn't know. But now we do, and we're going to fix this. Dr. Helen Bradford arrived at Denver General Hospital within the hour of Maggie's call. The child psychologist had worked with trauma cases for 20 years, but the situation with Sophie Turner was uniquely heartbreaking. In the emergency room, Sophie lay on a bed with an oxygen mask over her small face, her mother Rachel clutching her hand and crying quietly. The good news, Dr. Bradford told them after reviewing the test results, is that we caught this in time. Sophie's carbon monoxide levels are elevated but not critically dangerous. With treatment and fresh air, she should make a full physical recovery. But the nightmares? Rachel asked. The boogeyman she kept talking about. Dr. Bradford pulled up a chair. Carbon monoxide poisoning can cause hallucinations, especially in children. The headaches, the breathing difficulties, the sense of a presence in the room, all of these are symptoms of CO poisoning. Sophie wasn't making it up or having normal nightmares. She was experiencing very real physical symptoms that her young mind tried to make sense of by creating the image of a boogeyman. James, who had stayed throughout the entire process, felt relief wash over him. Not abuse. Not neglect. A terrible accident that was now being addressed. Architected narrative arc balancing hardship, redemption, and community compassion. I need to continue building the story while showing Rachel's struggle and James's growing involvement. The story needs to show unexpected kindness and community support. I should introduce the financial struggles and the estrangement from her father soon to set up the redemption arc. The apartment is condemned until repairs are made, Officer Jensen informed Rachel gently. You and Sophie can't go back there. The panic that crossed Rachel's face was immediate and total. I can't afford a hotel. I barely afford that apartment. I'm already 3 weeks behind on rent because I missed work when Sophie was sick. I don't have anywhere else to go. What about family? Maggie asked softly. Rachel's expression hardened. My father and I haven't spoken in 5 years. He didn't approve of my ex-husband and told me I was making a mistake. When I needed help after he left, my father said I made my bed and I should lie in it. So no, there's no family. James had been quiet, thinking, calculating. He'd built his fortune by seeing problems and creating solutions. This was a solvable problem. A family needed safe housing, medical care, and a chance to get back on their feet. He had the resources to provide all of that. I'd like to help, he said simply. Everyone turned to look at him. Rachel shook her head immediately. You've already done so much. You found Sophie. You stayed with her. You made sure we got help. I can't ask you for anything more. You're not asking. I'm offering. James kept his voice gentle but firm. I can arrange safe housing for you and Sophie while your apartment situation gets resolved. I can also make sure Sophie gets any follow-up care she needs. I don't take charity, Rachel said, lifting her chin despite the tears still streaming down her face. It's not charity. It's a human being helping another human being who needs it. James looked at Sophie, still small and pale on the hospital bed. Your daughter almost died because of a landlord's negligence. You work 2 jobs trying to provide for her. Let someone help you for once. Dr. Bradford nodded approvingly. Mrs. Turner, I strongly recommend you accept. Sophie needs a safe environment to recover, both physically and emotionally. The trauma of what she's experienced will take time to heal. Rachel looked at her daughter, then back at James. Why? Why would you do this for strangers? James thought about that question. Because I can. And because Sophie deserves to grow up without being afraid of the boogeyman. Real or imagined. After a long moment, Rachel nodded slowly. Okay. Thank you. I'll pay you back somehow, I promise. Let's just focus on getting Sophie healthy, James said. Everything else can wait. The furnished apartment James arranged was in a safe neighborhood in Denver's Capitol Hill area, worlds away from the basement on Alameda. It had 2 bedrooms, actual heating, and windows that let in natural light. When Rachel and Sophie walked in the next day, both of them stood in stunned silence. This is too much, Rachel whispered, taking in the clean furniture, the stocked refrigerator, the children's books on the shelf. It's temporary housing, James said, though he'd already decided he'd keep paying for it as long as they needed. Just until you figure out your next steps. Over the next few days, James learned more about Rachel's situation, and each revelation was more troubling than the last. She'd been working as a waitress at a diner and cleaning offices at night, trying to cobble together enough money to survive. Her ex-husband had left her with significant debt from his gambling problem. She had no college degree, no family support, and no safety net. The worst part, Rachel confided one afternoon while Sophie napped, is that my father was right. He told me not to marry Kevin. He said Kevin was irresponsible and would break my heart. And he did. But when I finally left Kevin and reached out to my dad for help, he turned me away. He said I needed to learn from my mistakes. That's harsh, James said carefully. Rachel's laugh was bitter. That's my father. Frank Turner, owner of Turner's Hardware on South Broadway. Used to be a successful store when I was growing up. Now it's barely hanging on. Just like him. Just like me. Have you tried reaching out since then? Why would I? He made it clear I'm not welcome. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Sophie's never even met her grandfather. And now I'm taking charity from a stranger because I'm too proud to beg my own father for help. James recognized the pain of family rifts. He'd built his company partly to prove something to a father who'd never believed in him. Sometimes pride gets in the way of healing. For everyone involved. That evening, James did something he knew might be overstepping. He looked up Turner's Hardware and drove past it. The store was in an older building, its sign faded and paint peeling. Inside, through the dusty windows, he could see an older man with Rachel's same blue eyes sitting behind a mostly empty counter. Meanwhile, Dr. Bradford continued working with Sophie. The little girl was recovering physically, but the psychological impact of weeks of poisoning had taken its toll. She has anxiety about going to sleep, Dr. Bradford explained in a session James attended at Rachel's request. Her brain associates darkness and bedtime with pain and fear. We're working through it, but she needs stability and safety to truly heal. What about school? Rachel asked. She's missed 3 weeks now. Let's give her another week to stabilize, then we can talk about returning to school with appropriate support. As they left the session, Rachel seemed to crumble. I need to find a job. I need to figure out permanent housing. I need to do all of this, and I don't even know where to start. James had been thinking about this constantly. What if I told you there might be a way to solve multiple problems at once? Rachel looked at him suspiciously. What do you mean? Your father's hardware store. It's struggling. You need income and stability. What if there was a way to bring you both to the table? Absolutely not, Rachel said immediately. He made his choice 5 years ago. People change. Circumstances change. James chose his words carefully. And sometimes it takes someone from outside to help families see what they are missing. James Mitchell's office in downtown Denver took up the entire top floor of a sleek glass building, with views of the Rocky Mountains that tourists would pay good money to see. But this morning, he wasn't focused on the view. He was focused on the situation report his assistant had compiled on Turner's hardware. The numbers were worse than he'd expected. Frank Turner was 3 months behind on his commercial lease. The store inventory was depleted. Suppliers had stopped extending credit. The business was perhaps 2 months from closing forever. Rachel arrived at his office looking uncomfortable in her nicest outfit, which was still worn around the edges. "You said you wanted to discuss something important." James gestured to a comfortable chair. "I've been thinking about your situation. You need stable income and housing. Sophie needs security to heal. And your father's business is failing." Rachel's expression hardened. "I told you I'm not interested in reconnecting with him." "Hear me out," James said gently. "I'd like to make you an offer, but I want to be completely transparent about what I'm proposing. I want to help you rebuild your life, but I also think there's an opportunity here for something bigger. Something that could help not just you, but other families in similar situations." He pulled out the folder. "I want to start a foundation focused on housing safety. Inspecting low-income housing for hazards like the one that nearly killed Sophie. Helping families who are displaced by dangerous conditions. Providing resources for people trying to get back on their feet." Rachel stared at him. "That's wonderful. But what does it have to do with me?" "I want you to be part of it. Not as charity, but as an employee. You've lived through what these families are experiencing. You understand their challenges. And you need a real job with real income, not piecing together minimum wage positions. I don't have any qualifications for that kind of work. You have the most important qualification, lived experience. The rest we can train." James leaned forward. "But there's another component. Your father's hardware store could become a resource hub. A place where families can get affordable supplies for home repairs. Where we could offer workshops on home safety. It would give his business new purpose and income." Rachel shook her head. "He would never agree to that. And I'm not ready to face him." "I understand," James said. "But Sophie almost died because of unsafe housing. Your father lost his daughter because of stubbornness. How many other families are suffering right now because no one is bridging these gaps?" The words hung in the air. Rachel looked out the window, her jaw working as she fought emotions. "You don't know what he said to me. How he made me feel." "You're right, I don't. But I do know that Sophie deserves to know her grandfather. And your father deserves a chance to meet his granddaughter." James pulled out another document. "This is a preliminary business plan. No commitments required. Just look it over. Think about it." Rachel took the folder with shaking hands. "Why are you doing all of this? Really?" James thought about the question carefully. "Because I spent 20 years building a company that made me rich, but didn't make me feel like I'd made a difference. When I found Sophie in that park, something shifted. I realized I could actually help people, not just profit margins. This foundation, it's not about charity. It's about creating real change. And if I say no to involving my father, then we find another way. This only works if everyone is willing. I won't force a reunion you're not ready for." Rachel stood to leave, clutching the folder. At the door, she turned back. "That night in the park, when you found Sophie, what made you stop? Most people would have just called 911 and left." "I have a daughter," James said quietly, revealing something he hadn't mentioned before. "She's grown now, in college. But when Sophie said she was being hurt, all I could think about was how I would want someone to treat my daughter if she was in trouble and I wasn't there." Rachel's eyes welled up. "Thank you. For everything." After she left, James sat at his desk and made a decision. Whether Rachel agreed or not, he was moving forward with the foundation. But he hoped she'd see the opportunity here. Not just for herself, but for Sophie. And maybe, if the stars aligned, for healing a family that had been broken for too long. 2 weeks later, Rachel stood outside Turner's Hardware with James beside her and Sophie holding her hand. She'd read the business proposal a dozen times. She'd argued with herself constantly. She'd almost called James twice to cancel this meeting. But here she was. "We don't have to do this if you're not ready," James said gently. "I'm not ready," Rachel admitted. "But Dr. Bradford says Sophie needs family connections. And you're right that this foundation could help other families. So I'm doing it anyway." The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The store smelled like wood and metal and memories. Rachel's chest tightened. She'd spent so much of her childhood here, helping her father organize inventory, learning the difference between Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, feeling proud that she was part of the family business. Frank Turner looked up from behind the counter, and the color drained from his face. "Rachel." "Hi, Dad." Her voice shook despite her determination to stay strong. Frank's eyes moved to Sophie, and something in his weathered face cracked. "Is this? This is your granddaughter. Sophie, this is your grandfather." Sophie pressed against Rachel's leg, shy and uncertain. Frank came around the counter slowly, as if afraid sudden movement would make them disappear. "She looks just like you did at that age," he said, his voice rough with emotion. James stepped forward, giving them space but providing a buffer. "Mr. Turner, I'm James Mitchell. I've been helping Rachel and Sophie through a difficult situation. I'd like to discuss a business opportunity with you, if you're willing to hear it." Frank tore his eyes away from Sophie. "Business opportunity? This store is barely surviving." "I know. That's why I'm here." They sat in the small office at the back of the store, Sophie exploring the aisles with wide eyes while the adults talked. James laid out his vision. The foundation for housing safety. The need for a community hub where families could access affordable supplies and education. The potential for Turner's Hardware to be transformed into something that served a deeper purpose. "You want to save my failing store by turning it into a charity," Frank said flatly. "I want to save your failing store by giving it a sustainable business model that also serves the community," James corrected. "The foundation would rent space here for offices. Would provide capital for inventory upgrades. You'd maintain ownership and run the retail side. Would run educational programs and resource distribution. It would bring consistent income and foot traffic." Frank looked at Rachel. "And you'd work for this foundation?" "James has offered me a position, yes. Helping families navigate housing safety issues and connect with resources." "Because you're qualified for that." Frank's tone was skeptical. Rachel felt the old anger rising. "Because I nearly lost my daughter to carbon monoxide poisoning from a negligent landlord. Because I know what it's like to work yourself to exhaustion and still not have enough. Because I understand what these families are going through." The room went quiet. Frank's expression shifted from skeptical to stunned. "What happened?" Slowly, Rachel told the story. The basement apartment. Sophie's nightmares and symptoms. The faulty furnace. James finding Sophie in the park. The hospitalization. The condemnation of their home. Orchestrated emotional arc and community resolution trajectory. "This is going well. I need to show Frank's emotional response and begin the reconciliation. The story needs to show unexpected kindness leading to healing and redemption. I'm at about chapter 6 now, so I need to continue building toward the community rallying and the full resolution." "You almost died," Frank said to Sophie, who had wandered back to stand near Rachel. "And I didn't even know. I didn't even know you existed." "That was my choice," Rachel said quietly. "You told me I was on my own. I was angry. I was hurt that you didn't listen to me about Kevin." Frank's hands trembled as he ran them through his gray hair. "I thought tough love would make you stronger. Instead, I just lost my daughter. And I missed 5 years of my granddaughter's life." "Mr. Turner," James said gently, "what happened in the past can't be changed. But what happens next is up to all of you." Frank looked at his empty store, then at his daughter and granddaughter. "If I agree to this, would you consider coming back? Not to the store necessarily, but to the family." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Dad." "I'm not asking for forgiveness I haven't earned," Frank said. "I'm asking for a chance to try. To be the father and grandfather I should have been 5 years ago." "Sophie," who had been quiet through all of this, suddenly spoke up. "Do you like books? Mommy reads to me every night now, because I'm not afraid of the boogeyman anymore." Frank's face crumpled. He knelt down stiffly to Sophie's level. "I love books. Maybe sometime I could read to you too." Sophie looked at Rachel for permission. Rachel nodded through her tears. "Maybe," Sophie said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even resolution. But it was a beginning. James stood. "I'll leave you all to talk. Mr. Turner, look over the proposal. Rachel, take whatever time you need. This only works if everyone is genuinely willing to try." As James walked out of the hardware store, leaving the fractured family to navigate their first real conversation in 5 years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just for the foundation or the business plan, but for the simple power of giving people a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Pastor Daniel Roberts of Hope Community Church had been serving Denver's neighborhoods for 30 years. When James Mitchell called him about the new foundation and asked for help spreading the word, Daniel immediately understood the potential. "There are dozens of families in our congregation struggling with unsafe housing," Daniel told James at their first meeting. "And many more who want to help but don't know how." Within days, Daniel had mobilized the church community. The sermon that Sunday was about unexpected blessings and the importance of being vessels for helping others. He told Sophie's story, with Rachel's permission, and the response was overwhelming. Beth Anderson, a pediatrician who attended Hope Community, immediately offered to volunteer for the foundation. "I see kids with mysterious symptoms all the time," she told James. "I never considered that some might be environmental. I want to help screen families for housing hazards." Local contractors stepped forward offering discounted services. A lawyer volunteered to help families dealing with negligent landlords. A therapist offered trauma counseling for children affected by housing crises. The transformation of Turner's Hardware began in earnest. James had secured funding not just from his own resources, but from other business leaders he'd connected with through Pastor Daniel. Frank was overwhelmed as delivery trucks began arriving with new inventory, as painters refreshed the exterior, as volunteers helped reorganize and modernize the store. "I don't understand why strangers care about my failing business," Frank admitted to James as they watched the renovations progress. "Because it's not just your business anymore. It's becoming a community hub. People want to be part of something meaningful." James gestured to the workers, many of them volunteers from Hope Community Church. "They are not doing this for you specifically. They are doing it because they believe in what we're building." Rachel had started training for her position with the foundation. Maggie Collins, the social worker who had first responded to Sophie's case, was teaching her the systems and procedures. "You're natural at this," Maggie told her during one session. "You listen without judgment. You understand the fear and shame that comes with needing help. These families will trust you in ways they might not trust someone who hasn't lived it." Sophie was thriving. Dr. Bradford reported that her anxiety about sleep had diminished significantly now that she was in safe housing and understood that the boogeyman had been real symptoms, not imaginary monsters. She'd returned to school and was catching up academically with the help of a tutor the foundation provided. And slowly, painfully, the relationship between Rachel and Frank was beginning to heal. It started with supervised visits, Sophie and Frank reading together in the children's section of a newly renovated hardware store. Then family dinners, awkward at first but gradually more comfortable. Conversations about the past, facilitated by a family therapist James quietly arranged and paid for. "I can't believe I almost missed all of this," Frank said one evening as he watched Sophie demonstrate how to properly use a measuring tape. "She's brilliant, just like her mother was." Rachel, standing beside James at the edge of the store, wiped her eyes. She corrected gently. "Just like her mother is." Frank smiled. "Yes, is." Some stories remind us that help can come from the most unexpected places, and that second chances can change everything. What's a time someone showed you unexpected kindness? Subscribe and share your story in the comments below. The foundation officially launched 6 weeks after James found Sophie in the park. The event was held at Turner's Hardware, which now had a bright new sign reading Turner's Hardware and Community Resource Center. Local news covered the story, focusing on Sophie's near tragedy and the community response. This foundation exists because one little girl was brave enough to tell a stranger she needed help, James told the crowd gathered for the opening. And because that led to discovering a problem that affects thousands of families in our city. Unsafe housing shouldn't be a death sentence. And no family should have to navigate these challenges alone. Rachel stood beside him, nervous but determined. I know what it's like to be proud and afraid to ask for help. I know what it's like to work yourself to exhaustion and still fall short. This foundation isn't about handouts. It's about giving families the tools and support they need to build safe, stable lives for their children. The applause was genuine and warm. And as Rachel looked around at the packed store, at her father beaming with pride, at Sophie safe and happy and surrounded by people who cared, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt hopeful. 3 months after the foundation launched, Rachel sat in her new office at Turner's Hardware reviewing case files. The foundation had already helped 17 families identify and remediate housing hazards. They'd connected 8 families with better housing options. And they'd started educational workshops on tenant rights and home safety. You're natural at this, Maggie told her during one of their regular check-ins. The families trust you. They feel seen and heard. Rachel smiled, remembering how just a few months ago she'd been one of those families. Desperate, frightened, alone. Now she was helping others navigate the same challenges. Sophie had blossomed in the stable environment. She was excelling in 3rd grade, had made friends, and her nightmares had completely disappeared. Most importantly, she developed a close relationship with Frank, who picked her up from school twice a week and let her help around the hardware store. Grandpa taught me how to mix paint today, Sophie announced proudly one afternoon. And he said when I'm older, he'll teach me how to use all the tools. Frank had transformed along with his store. The renovation hadn't just saved his business, it had given him renewed purpose. He ran woodworking workshops for kids on Saturday mornings. He'd started a tool library where people could borrow equipment they couldn't afford to buy. And he'd become one of the foundation's most passionate advocates. I was so focused on being right that I lost 5 years with my daughter, Frank told a local news reporter who was doing a follow-up story. I let pride destroy what mattered most. This work, helping these families, it's my way of making amends. Not just to Rachel, but to everyone I turned away when they needed help. James had taken a step back from day-to-day operations of his tech company to focus more on the foundation. He discovered that he found more satisfaction in helping families like Rachel's than he'd ever found in quarterly earnings reports. You've changed, his daughter observed during one of her visits home from college. You're happier than I've seen you in years. I finally figured out what success actually means, James replied. It's not about how much money you make. It's about how many lives you touch. The foundation expanded its services based on feedback from the families they served. They added job training programs, partnering with local businesses to provide pathways out of poverty. They created a rental assistance program for families displaced by unsafe housing. They established a rapid response team that could inspect housing within 24 hours of a complaint. Beth Anderson, the pediatrician who had volunteered from the beginning, started a program to screen children for signs of environmental hazards during routine checkups. Sophie's case opened my eyes, she explained. How many kids have I seen with chronic headaches or respiratory issues that I attributed to other causes when it might have been their housing? Pastor Daniel's church had essentially adopted the foundation as a mission project. Volunteers provided everything from childcare to translation services to transportation. The church's annual budget included a dedicated line for housing safety initiatives. This is what community looks like, Daniel preached one Sunday. Not just attending services together, but actively caring for our neighbors. Being willing to show up when someone needs help. Rachel's relationship with her father had progressed from tentative to genuinely close. They'd worked through years of hurt and resentment with the help of their family therapist. The breakthrough came when Frank finally apologized without conditions or justifications. I was wrong, he told Rachel simply. I was angry and stubborn and I prioritized being right over being your father. I'm sorry. I'm deeply, profoundly sorry. Rachel had cried in his arms for the first time in years. I'm sorry too. For not reaching out again. For keeping Sophie from you. We both made mistakes, Frank said. But look what happened when we finally stopped being stubborn and let people help us. We got our family back. On Thanksgiving, Rachel, Sophie, and Frank celebrated together for the first time in years. James joined them, having become part of their extended family through the shared mission of the foundation. "I'm thankful for Mr. James," Sophie announced during the traditional going around the table sharing. "Because he stopped when I was scared and he made sure I was okay. And now my mommy helps other kids be not scared too." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm thankful for you too, Sophie, for being brave enough to tell someone you needed help." By the Foundation's 6-month anniversary, the impact was measurable and significant. They'd helped 43 families identify and address housing hazards. 3 negligent landlords had been forced to make repairs or face legal consequences. 2 apartment buildings had been completely remediated. And most importantly, no children had been seriously harmed by preventable housing hazards in any of the neighborhoods where the foundation worked. But the real transformation was in the people themselves. Rachel had discovered a calling she never knew she had. She was completing online coursework to earn a certificate in social work, studying late at night after Sophie went to bed. The foundation paid for her education as part of their employee development program. "You're going to make an incredible social worker," Maggie told her. "You have something that can't be taught. You genuinely care, and people know it." Frank's hardware store had become a cornerstone of the community. The combination of retail business, foundation offices, and community programming meant the store was busy from morning until evening. Frank had hired 2 part-time employees to help manage the increased activity, both of them clients of the foundation who needed employment. "This place has purpose again," Frank told James. "When I was young, hardware stores were community gathering spots. Then the big box stores came, and everything became about price and efficiency. This feels like we're getting back to something important." Sophie had become something of a mascot for the foundation, though James and Rachel were careful to protect her privacy. She'd written an essay for school about the night Mr. James found me that her teacher had encouraged her to share. With Sophie's permission, they'd used excerpts in the foundation's newsletter, and the response had been overwhelming. Donations poured in from people who were moved by her story. "I want other kids to not be scared of the boogeyman," Sophie told a reporter who was careful to hide her identity in the article. "Because sometimes the boogeyman is real, but we can make him go away if grown-ups help." James had expanded his vision for the foundation beyond Denver. He'd begun conversations with civic leaders in other cities about replicating the model. The combination of housing safety inspections, community resource hubs, and family support services was proving to be effective and sustainable. But perhaps the most powerful development was what happened with the families who had been helped by the foundation. Many of them began volunteering once they'd stabilized their own situations. It created a beautiful cycle where those who had received help became helpers themselves. Maria Gonzalez, whose family had been dealing with mold exposure that had hospitalized her youngest son, now volunteered as a translator for the foundation. "Someone helped us when we were desperate," she explained. "Now it's my turn to help others." Kevin and Amanda Johnson, who had been displaced by a building fire caused by faulty wiring, started a support group for families going through housing crises. "We know what it feels like to lose everything," Amanda said. "Having people who understand makes all the difference." The foundation's most ambitious project came when James learned about an entire apartment complex that was in violation of multiple safety codes. Rather than just reporting it, James purchased the building outright and began a complete renovation, working with the existing tenants to keep them housed during the process. "This is bigger than a foundation," Rachel realized during a planning meeting. "This is about transforming how we think about housing and community responsibility." "That's exactly right," James agreed. "Sophie's case showed us that the system is broken. We're not just putting band-aids on problems. We're trying to change the system itself." Turner's Hardware became a model that other businesses began studying. The combination of for-profit retail and non-profit community service created a sustainable model that others wanted to replicate. Business schools requested to study their approach. Frank found himself giving presentations about how to integrate social purpose into traditional business models. "I'm just a hardware store owner," Frank would protest when praised for his innovative thinking. "You're the hardware store owner who said yes when you could have said no," James would remind him. "You're the grandfather who chose reconciliation over pride. That matters more than any business degree." The reconciliation between Rachel and Frank had rippled out to other relationships. Frank reached out to old friends he'd lost touch with. Rachel reconnected with childhood friends. The family that had been fractured was not just healed but expanded, creating new connections and strengthening old ones. On Sophie's 8th birthday, they held the party at Turner's Hardware, inviting all the families the foundation had helped. The store was packed with children and parents, with laughter and joy that echoed off the walls. "This is what victory looks like," James told Rachel as they watched Sophie blow out her candles, surrounded by friends and family. One little girl who was brave enough to ask for help changed an entire community. 1 year after James Mitchell found Sophie crying in Washington Park, the foundation held its anniversary celebration. The event brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by that pivotal moment. The numbers were impressive. The foundation had helped over 150 families. They'd identified and remediated hazards in 47 buildings. They'd provided job training to 63 parents. They'd created a network of volunteer inspectors, contractors, and support services that operated across 3 counties. But the statistics didn't capture the real story. Rachel stood at the front of the room in Turner's Hardware, now officially renamed Turner's Hardware and Community Resource Center, preparing to speak. A year ago, she'd been desperate, exhausted, and alone. Now she was a certified social work assistant, employed full-time by a foundation that was changing lives, and reconciled with her father. "When Mr. Mitchell found Sophie in that park, I was at my lowest point," Rachel began, her voice steady despite her emotions. "I was working myself to exhaustion and still falling short. My daughter was being poisoned and I didn't know it. I was too proud to ask for help and too afraid to hope that things could get better." She looked at James, who stood near the back of the crowded room. "James showed me that accepting help isn't weakness. It's wisdom. And that sometimes strangers become family when they choose to show up for each other." Sophie, now 8 and confident, stood beside her grandfather Frank. She was wearing a bright red dress and had insisted on helping set up for the event. The shy, frightened girl from a year ago had become a joyful child who loved school, adored her grandfather, and no longer feared the dark. Frank spoke next, his voice rough with emotion. "I lost 5 years with my daughter because I was stubborn and proud. I almost lost my business because I couldn't adapt to change. This foundation didn't just save my store. It saved my family. It gave me a chance to be the father and grandfather I should have been all along." James had asked not to speak, preferring to let the families tell their own stories. But Pastor Daniel insisted. "You started all of this," Daniel reminded him. "People need to hear from you." Reluctantly, James took the microphone. "A year ago, I was successful by every traditional measure. I had money, status, and influence. But I wasn't happy. I'd spent so long building a business that I'd forgotten to build a life that mattered." He looked around the room at the faces of families they'd helped, volunteers who'd given their time, community partners who'd joined the mission. "Sophie, when I found you in that park, you were so scared. You told me the boogeyman was hurting you, and you were right. But here's what I learned. The real boogeymen aren't monsters under the bed. They are systems that fail families. Landlords who prioritize profit over safety. Policies that punish poverty. Communities that look away when neighbors are struggling." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I also learned that ordinary people can fight those boogeymen. By showing up. By caring. By refusing to walk past someone who needs help. Everyone in this room has chosen to be that person for someone else. That's how we change the world, one act of kindness at a time." The applause was thunderous, but James raised his hand for quiet. "I have an announcement. The foundation is expanding. We're opening resource centers in 4 more cities next year. We're creating a training program so other communities can replicate this model. And we're establishing an endowment to ensure this work continues for generations." More applause, but James wasn't done. "But none of that matters as much as this. Sophie is safe. Rachel and Frank are family again. Families who were struggling are now thriving. That's the real measure of success." Not how much we do, but how well we love each other through the doing. Later, as the celebration wound down, Sophie approached James with something in her hands. It was a drawing she'd made in art class. It showed a park bench with two figures, one small and one tall, under a starry sky. "This is you finding me," Sophie explained. "My teacher said I should give it to you because you're my hero." James knelt down to Sophie's level, accepting the drawing with careful reverence. "Sophie, I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time." "But you stopped," Sophie insisted with the absolute certainty of a child. "Mommy says lots of people walked by that night, but you stopped. That makes you a hero." James felt tears prick his eyes. "Then I guess we're both heroes. Because you were brave enough to tell me you needed help. That takes courage." As the evening ended and families began heading home, James stood with Rachel and Frank, watching Sophie play with other children in the store. "What's next?" Rachel asked. "You've built something amazing here. What happens now?" James smiled. "Now we keep going. We help more families. We expand the model. We prove that communities thrive when we choose to take care of each other." He looked at the drawing Sophie had given him, at the simple depiction of the moment that had changed all their lives. And we remember that it all started because one little girl was brave enough to say she needed help, and one stranger was willing to stop and listen. Everything else grew from that single moment of human connection. Frank put his arm around Rachel. "To new beginnings." "To family," Rachel added. "To hope," James finished. They stood together in the warm light of the community center that had once been a failing hardware store, surrounded by the evidence of what happens when people choose kindness over indifference, connection over isolation, and love over fear. Sophie's laughter rang out across the space, bright and joyful and completely free of fear. The boogeyman was gone, defeated not by weapons of violence but by the simple power of people who cared enough to help. And in that moment, James understood the true measure of wealth. It wasn't in his bank account or his business empire. It was in this room, in these relationships, in the knowledge that he'd used his resources to make the world a little bit better for people who needed it. 1 year ago, he'd been walking through a park with no particular purpose. Today, he had more purpose than he'd ever imagined possible. All because he'd chosen to stop when someone needed help. That, James thought, was the kind of success worth building a life around.